everyone. Thank you all so much for attending tonight's lecture. My name is David Daly, and I'm the curator of Washington's headquarters, National Historic Site. And it is my pleasure tonight to be introducing our speaker, Richard Nylander. This is our third annual installment of the Jim Shea Lecture Series. For those of you who might not be familiar with the program, the Jim Shea Lecture Series was begun in 2013 as a way to honor the work and contributions of Jim Shea, who I know is here. Where is he hiding? There he is in the back hiding. For all of his work and contributions to the National Park Service. Jim is the former longtime curator and site manager of the Longfellow House, if you didn't know, and retired in 2012. The purpose of these talks, this series, is to increase public knowledge of and exposure to the rich collections at the Longfellow House. Prior lectures in the series have focused on 19th century Boston area furniture that we have in the house, as well as the Japanese screens collected by Charles Appleton Longfellow, the poet's son, during his trips to Japan in the late 1800s. So tonight, as you can probably tell from the screen, we're going to hear about some of the house's historic wallpapers, which cover a span of time from the mid-18th to the mid-20th century. And for this talk, we are very fortunate to have Mr. Nylander as our speaker. Richard Nylander is a leading authority in historic wallpaper. He began his career in 1967 working for the Society for the Preservation of New England Antiquities, the organization now known as Historic New England. And under his guidance, Historic New England built what is the best documented collection of regional historic wallpaper in the country. Mr. Nylander has published many books and articles on the subject, including Wallpapers for Historic Buildings, a guide to selecting reproduction wallpapers, and Wallpaper in New England, selections from the Society for the Preservation of New England Antiquities. Since 1990, he has also served as a member of the Committee for the Preservation of the White House, and as such, he's assisted in the refurbishment of several White House interior spaces, including the Lincoln bedroom. Right? Get the right moves. After retiring from Historic New England in 2008, Richard received the title of Curator Emeritus, and he continues to be active in the field, writing, lecturing, and assisting with preservation and education programs, such as Historic New England's program in New England Studies, in which I was very fortunate to participate this past June. Richard and I corresponded a fair amount in the months leading up to tonight's talk, and on a recent visit to the house, we spent a few hours looking at wallpapers in the rooms, as well as many of the samples kept in storage, some of which many of you saw if you came to the open house prior to this. And I know that I learned quite a bit about the subject, a lot more than I did know before, as a result of just spending this little time with him. And I'm sure tonight's talk is going to be informative, entertaining, and interesting, and I suspect that he might even have a piece or two of new information for those of us who thought that we had a pretty good handle on what the Longfellow House wallpapers were all about. So without any further delay, please join me in giving a warm welcome to our speaker, Mr. Richard Nylander.
So interested in the Longfellow House and its collection. As David said, I worked for Historic New England with its wonderful collection of houses for 40 years. But it may come as a surprise to you that the Longfellow House has been my favorite historic house for even longer than that. It's sobering to realize that many of the photographs that I took in 1962 are included with the historic photographs that document the interiors in the 1999 Historic Furnishing Report compiled by Sarah Peel.
Excuse me, could you speak up, please?
I will try. I wish this were closer. Working a bit more. Maybe I'll lean over like this. Is that better? Yes. When I was growing up, we played the game of authors a lot. Many of you probably did too. And my family was interested in old houses because we lived in Acton, Mass, visiting many of the houses of local authors was very easy for us to do. At that point, I was very interested in Victorian decorative arts, and in the 1960s and early 70s, there was absolutely many fewer places to see Victorian interiors. So Longfellow House quickly became one of my favorites. As David said, tonight's presentation is going to focus on another decorative art that I've studied for almost 50 years. That's really sobering too, because that's a half a century. I don't like to think of that. And the ones in particular related to the Longfellow House. Many of you went to see the papers that are still on the walls at the open house just now, and some of the fragments that David had brought out that have been discovered during various structural investigations. To me, combined, they present a wonderful case study of changing tastes in decoration from the mid-18th to the early 20th centuries, all in one house, and I think it's very interesting. We've got basically only 3 major owners or families that owned the house, so we can see what their tastes were originally, and in the case of the Longfellows, how they changed over the course of years. Much of the information on the wallpapers was compiled in 1997 by Maureen Phillips, and that's been very helpful to me in understanding the context where many of the samples were found. And I want to thank David for scanning the copy. I left mine at work when I retired 6 years ago. So he provided a scan of the report for me to read, and very good images of some of the papers. And as you can see, they come in many shapes and sizes. I think some of the most interesting are these down here. You're probably wondering where those came from. And those came from behind the bell pull in the Longfellow's bedroom. And you can see a wonderful, what we call a sandwich of different layers. I think beginning with the Vassalls period and ending up with the Longfellows. I'm not going to discuss every scrap of paper that was found. You'll be happy to know. But I really want to concentrate on some of the highlights in order to paint a picture of what the house looked like at different times in its history. There are only 2 fragments that relate to the decoration of the original 1759 house that John Vassalls built, and they were found in the upstairs back hall. As you can see, they're not big enough to give us very much of an idea of what the overall pattern was, but because of what we know about other wallpapers found in other houses in New England of the same period, I can show you what was available to John Vassalls when he was building the house, and we can get an idea of the types of things he might have chosen for the other rooms. All of the wallpapers that were in New England, and indeed in the colonies in the 18th century, were English made. They were either purchased at London shops like the ones you see on the screen, or from a stationer in Boston who had imported them. Stationers dealt with all kinds of paper goods, so it was only natural that they would handle wallpaper as well. And I think you can see in the center one, center trade card of Mr. Maysfield, some of the patterns that were available. They were probably accurately depicted in this trade card. We know from probate inventories and other documents, like the one on the screen, that in the 18th century, many rooms in a house were color coordinated. The paper, the fabric, and sometimes the paint were of the same color, not exactly matched like we do today, but yellow was yellow, and There might have been some variations. But for all intents and purposes, there was a yellow room in the house, a green room, and they were called such in the inventories. The diagram on the screen is one that was sent to England with an order for the proprietary house in New Jersey. This was a house being built by the royal governor in New Jersey. And it's very clear what they wanted. For the drawing room, it says it's to be papered with a handsome yellow paper, suitable for yellow curtains, curtains, chairs, etc. The dining parlor was going to be papered with a neat red and white paper, the curtains to be of red and white check of the best kind. So this is about 1770, so red and white check isn't necessarily country. This was the governor's mansion. And you can see that the governor's study, only a plain green paper would do because it was going to be covered with maps, and the housekeeper's room on the right needn't be papered. Stair halls in Georgian houses typically had what was called a pillared arch paper, like the one you see on the left. And this was a repeating pattern that formed a colonnade the length of the entire hall. If you were very rich, like Jeremiah Lee in Marblehead, you could order a different kind of custom-made wallpaper for your front hall, or indeed, as Lee did in many of the other rooms in his house. And these were designs, as you can see from the image on the right, that imitated framed oil paintings with trompe-l'oeil frames, and these triangles here would imitate stucco work. If you haven't been to the Lee Mansion, you really should. It's some of the best survivals of this type of wallpaper. There were a variety of other designs that were available in the 18th century for other rooms in the house. And you can see several on the screen. The Gothic design on the right came from a yellow chamber in the Moffat Ladd House in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Was used with yellow bed curtains and had yellow paint on the woodwork. And in the inventory, it was called the Yellow Chamber. The chinoiserie design, the oriental design on the gray ground, was found in a trunk. And the other designs, you can see a variety of floral designs and designs that imitate leafage. These would all, the three on the left, all came from the Jeremiah Lee house, so you can see a rather complete selection of wallpapers from that house. Often the best room in an 18th century house had what was called a flocked wallpaper to imitate cut velvet hangings. And these were created by adhering wool shavings to the design, and I'll explain that a little further a little later. This is an incredible survival, a whole room full of flock paper in the 1769 John Wentworth house in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And you can see on the right two borders, one printed and the other one molded paper mache, which very often was gilded. We assumed that whatever papers that were on Vassalls' walls were still there when the house was used as Washington's headquarters. As far as I know, and someone may correct me, Washington made no comments about them, so they may not have been that much out of the ordinary. He also had other things on his mind. And we also don't know whether subsequent owners, like the wealthy Nathaniel Tracy, made any changes or not. What we do know is that the next owner was out to make a splash, and that was Andrew Craigie. Craigie bought the house in 1791 and added the piazzas you see in this wonderful little mathematical exercise done by a Harvard student in 1815. He also added the large service L on the back of the house. Philadelphia seems to have been a major source for many of Craigies' furnishings, as well as other things like his cook, his gardener, his horses, and even his chickens. And it's really interesting to me that he was setting up this grand establishment as a bachelor. He didn't marry Elizabeth Shaw until 1793. And you can see, now you can see, Elizabeth Shaw on the right. This is a copy of a miniature that is on view in the parlor at the Longfellow house. And a miniature of Andrew Craigie is done by a man named Archibald Robertson and is at the American Antiquarian Society in Worcester. Longfellow said of Craigie's miniature that Mrs. Craigie seemed to cherish it more than she did the original. A dull, heavy face with powdered hair. There are only 2 references to wallpaper in the Craigie papers, even though more samples survive, which I'll show you in a few minutes. In November of 1791, he writes to his brother-in-law, Bossinger Foster, don't you love that name? I would not have the rooms papered until I return, as it is probable I may bring or order paper from New York. I find Mr. Burl Carnes, who was a Philadelphia dealer, has lately arrived from France, and perhaps he has bought some of the newest fashion of paper. If he has, you will secure it. A month later, Craigie is billed for 16 rolls of blue paper, which I imagine is just a plain blue paper. The French papers that Craigie was referring to were products of these incredible French paper stainers, as they were called, Jean-Baptiste Réveillon, who did these wonderful arabesques, like you see on the right, and others which made incredibly detailed and colored wallpapers, which were becoming very fashionable in houses of the elite. French styles were also very popular in other decorative arts. And we know that Craigie's biggest order was for a dozen chairs and 2 settees in a French style made by the Philadelphia cabinet maker Adam Haynes. These were upholstered by a French immigrant upholsterer in Philadelphia named George Berthold, who also made the curtains and cushions for the parlor. Craigie originally wanted blue silk. Was that to go with the blue wallpaper? I don't know. But he ended up with green, which must have been very similar to what you see on one of the chairs from a similar set of Adam Haynes chairs ordered by Theodore Lyman of Waltham about the same time. I was always curious what type of wallpaper went with such elegant furnishings, and I think the first clue came during the wallpaper conservation project that the National Park Service undertook in 1975. And this was a small scrap of green paper that you see on the screen that was found behind Fanny Longfellow's desk. And it wasn't French at all, but it was Chinese. This struck me as quite extravagant. These early Chinese papers were quite rare. Survivals are quite rare, but some New Englanders did have them. And here are 3 on the screen. The one on the left came to this country in 1806 and was brought over by a China trade merchant in Boston named Thomas Henderson Perkins. The one on the right was ordered by a man named Edward Carrington, who was also a China trader, for his house in Providence in 1812, and it is still on the walls. But the one in the center is the earliest, and I think one of the most remarkable. It came over to this country in 1784 on the Empress of China, which was the first American ship to trade directly with China. It was ordered by Robert Morris of Philadelphia, but for some reason remained unopened in its original boxes until 1923, and was found by Henry Sleeper in a house in Marblehead, and he later installed it in Beauport, in Gloucester, Massachusetts. So if you want to see the one in the center, go to Beauport. The large sample wasn't discovered until the large mirror in the parlor was taken down when the room was emptied for another conservation project. And it really is an eye-opener for when you think of French chairs and Chinese wallpaper. The horizontal lines you see crossing it are discolorations that were caused by the batten boards on the back of the mirror. But you can also see from the details how incredibly detailed these hand-painted Chinese papers were. I've always been curious about the arrangement, how much was saved by that mirror. Was Longfellow being sentimental, knowing it would be covered by the mirror, and kept a small sample of the paper that he knew so well from when he boarded with Mrs. Craigie in the house? Or was he just being cheap? Not wanting to waste any of the expensive French paper that he and Fanny had ordered? We'll never know. But I'm delighted he didn't paper completely over the Chinese paper. The small piece of paper found in the dining room may be a clue to the source of Craigies' Chinese paper. Originally, it was thought to be an inexpensive stencil design from the Vassalls era, used in Vassalls' kitchen. But in fact, it is part of another delicate hand-painted Chinese paper. Another version, I think you can see that on the right, is a fragment that was installed in the Shirley Eustace house by another China trader, James McGee, around 1798. And you can see that the motif is exactly the same. And these delicate pencil lines of the petals are the same. Curiously, another sample of this design has been found in a castle in Ireland, a whole room full. The paper has been reproduced and installed in the Shirley Eustace house, and I think you can get a good idea from this image, which was sent to me thanks to Rick Detweiler, that shows the repeating pattern installed in the breakfast room at the Shirley Eustace house, along with green paint, which is apparently what was in Craigie's dining room at the same time. I haven't yet been able to figure out the connection between Craigie and McGee, but someday perhaps we will. Perhaps it wasn't McGee at all. It could have been another China trade captain that brought these two wonderful papers to be used in the Longfellow house. We know that Elizabeth Craigie was well educated and very fluent in French, so I wasn't surprised to find some samples of early 19th century French papers in the collection. And you saw one of these on the table in the library tonight. The one on the left is a French paper dating to about 1805. It's an overall design printed in gray with an elaborate green flocked border. And on the right is an example of an immensely popular type of French paper, popular in this country between 1810 and 1825. They were advertised in Boston as landscape figures, and the patterns consisted of alternating vignettes, large and small, between stripes. any number of motifs could be plugged into this formula, as you can see from the examples on the screen. Some of them French, the one on the left possibly American. And you can see from the picture of the coffin house in Newbury, Massachusetts, where one of these still remains on the walls, how they would have appeared with the alternating large, small, teeny, as a matter of fact here, and placed so that they would repeat in a drop repeat on the walls. But the boldest of the Craigies papers is one that I was fascinated to see, and David had it out on the table tonight for you to see if you were over there. It's a combination of a festoon border with a rather bold geometric pattern of wavy Greek keys framed by lines with chevrons. An unusual combination, to say the least. And interesting that it was found in the second floor hall under the samples of Gothic paper that are still on the walls. And you wonder, I guess I wonder, if the whole Blue Entry might have had this paper to serve as a grand entrance to Craigies' enlarged room, which became Longfellow's library. The paper is French and dates to 1799 to 1800. The pattern is very similar to other patterns produced in France that are almost Art Deco in nature. And these are 1800, not 1930, or in the case of the one on the right, colors reminiscent of the 1950s, that wonderful combination of gray and pink. Before we go too much further, I want to inject a little wallpaper technology so we can understand what we've been looking at so far. With the exception of the hand-painted Chinese papers, everything that I've shown you so far has been block printed on handmade rag paper. We have this wonderful billhead from a Boston paper stainer named Ebenezer Clough, whose paper staining manufactory, you can see, was established in 1800. And all his products were protected by the new American Eagle. But the little vignettes are very explanatory into how a paper at this period was produced. On the upper right, you see the paper stainer and his apprentice gluing sheets of paper together to form the roll of paper. Continuous rolls of paper were not produced until about 1830, so a roll of wallpaper had to be created from pieces of paper about 21 inches square, glued together. Lower left, they are grinding pigments and mixing them in distemper to use as the ink to print the paper. And the paper stainer on the right, lower right, is laying the ground of the paper, the background color, with broad brushes. As I mentioned, this technology lasted until the 1830s, and indeed block printing continued to be very popular into the early 20th century. The final step, of course, here you can see how these seams would have looked. And if you're looking to figure out how early a paper is, if you find a paper with horizontal seams every 21 inches or so, you can be sure it was made before 1830. Here's what they look like on the back, and you can see them on this French paper, quite well camouflaged by the ground paper. That was the point. You weren't supposed to see them. The final step, of course, was using wood blocks to print the pattern, one for each color of the design. And this is what made hand-blocked wallpapers very expensive. They were very labor-intensive. When you think some of the papers that were advertised around 1800 had 12 or 13 colors. That's 13 different steps to print. The technology continued. On the screen you see the billhead of another Boston paper stainer, Jeremiah Bumstead. And here you can see the progression in the mid-19th century. About 1840, machine printing was being perfected. You still had people cutting wood blocks, prints as they were called, and printing by hand. But the new machines with rollers, the design engraved on rollers, which could use continuous paper, were also producing a lot of wallpaper. And here you see the many rolls. This machine is called a satining machine, and it was used to polish the ground of the paper to make it very reflective and shiny. It would reflect the light. Women were employed in factories to roll the papers, but also to apply gilding, which was on the most expensive papers. And of course, someone like Bumstead was probably full service, and he had the paper hangers who could come and install it in your house. His factory was in Roxbury, and his warehouse was on Washington Street in Boston, right next to the Old South Meeting House. And Bumstead is the one who supplied the first papers to the Longfellows when they moved into the house in 1843 after their marriage that year. At first, they only occupied 3 rooms, as you probably know. And Nathaniel Appleton, Fanny's father, purchased from Bumstead 3 rooms for wallpaper for these 3 rooms for the exorbitant price of $23.25. 2 of the patterns were $1 a roll, which was very expensive, and one of the other patterns was 62.5 cents a roll. The cheapest paper at this time was 13 cents a roll. Longfellow began as a boarder in the house in 1837. And as you know, Fanny's father bought the house for them as a wedding present and helped them decorate and furnish it. And the family continued to own the house, and the family association continued to own the house until it was given to the National Park Service. So they were the family who occupied the house the longest. And I love both these images on the screen, Longfellow and Fanny and their 2 oldest sons, Charles Appleton and Ernest Wadsworth. And little Ernie here is the one who created this delightful sketch of the house when he was about 10 years old in 1855. And it really says a lot. It's probably Henry, his father and mother here, and the 2 boys are up here peering out the windows, a bird cage in the other. But you see he's been very literal, and he has drawn the red curtains in his father's study and the floral curtains that were in the park. He also has shown his father's orange tree in the window too. It's just a great little picture. In 1844, the Longfellows occupied the whole house after the last of the tenants moved out. And this is presumably when the parlor was redecorated, probably about 1844 to 1845. And it is one of the rooms that contains its original wallpaper, and I think was very, very much revered by the Longfellow children, especially after their mother died in the tragic fire in 1861. But you can see the large mirror where the Chinese paper was discovered behind that, and also the French wallpaper printed in 13 different colors that was chosen for that room. The room was photographed as early as the late 1860s, and therefore images of this and the house, and there were many stereos of the house, satisfied the curious public about what authors' houses looked like inside. There were many books in the 19th century that were devoted to authors' houses, the homes and haunts of popular authors. Americans were very curious about how they lived, and I think stereo views like this and the woodcuts that were published in these books probably gave the public a very good idea of the decoration in the authors' houses and helped inform their own sense of decoration. The pattern the Longfellows chose is one of many of the revival styles of the mid-19th century. It's called the Rococo Revival style, and you can see the patterns were created from naturalistic patterns of flowers and garlands of flowers scattered on a framework of sea scrolls. As I mentioned, Longfellows was printed in 13 colors. And like the landscape figures, these Rococo Revival papers were available in an endless variety of French and American-made copies. French styles dominated the wallpaper scene throughout the 19th century until about the 1870s or 80s. And even wallpaper manufacturers like Josiah Lumsted could not tell the difference between, when he went to a trade show, between an American-made paper or French-made paper or an American copy. So I don't feel so bad when people ask me, is it French or American? I can't tell you. Another popular style was the Gothic Revival, and many of you have saw the small Gothic Revival pattern that the Longfellows chose for the back stair hall. Alexander Jackson Downing was one individual who popularized the Gothic cottage as the ideal home to live in the mid-19th century. But like the English critic Augustus Pugin, he detested wallpapers with pointed arches, calling them miserable patterns. But they were very popular with the general public and were produced both in France and in America in endless varieties. The one the Longfellows chose was smaller in scale than the others you see on the screen, but has the same composition of pinnacles and crockets and little landscape vignettes seen through those detestable pointed arches. The tulip patterns show the subdued color that was favored by A.J. Downing. He liked these earth colors. He also liked Rococo Revival patterns too, and suggested that they could be used in Gothic Revival cottages. So it's a mixing up of styles, which I think we probably might not do today. So I pulled together on one screen all of the papers that survived from the Longfellow period, from the 1840s and 50s. And with the exception of the three on top, you can see this very subdued monochromatic palette that they favored. And no doubt they provided a wide contrast with brightly colored chintz curtains and carpets that were available and probably used in those same rooms. This one is still on the walls in the attic, in an attic room, but may have been left over from one of the bed chambers on the second floor. Two, again, monochromatic papers used in the L. This one fragment, it's hard to read, but it's big leafy scrolls, was found in the closet off the Longfellows' bedroom. And I just wonder if it wasn't the same pattern they used in their bedroom that was relieved at the cornice level by a brightly colored floral border. It'd be interesting to know, but I don't know as we ever will know all of their choices. The scrolls on the lower right, which you now can see on the left-hand side of the screen, come from Longfellow's study. And they, I think, are similar to the scroll pattern that I have placed in the middle of the screen. I'm not saying it's the exact same pattern, but I think it's the same framework that might have been used. And if you look really carefully at this late 1860s view of the poet in his study, you can see there is some sort of pattern on the walls, again with a border at the cornice level and the orange tree. About 1869, Longfellow writes in a letter that the study is completely occupied by paper hangers. So we assume that the paper printed in grisaille was replaced by the plain colors paper that has now been painted brown on the wall, that is accented with a border of bamboo strips. So you can see an earlier view, you can also tell where I've got it off the internet, but then replaced with these bamboo strips and and the configuration that was used in the corners of the room. Very looking towards the aesthetic movement of the 1870s and 80s. The Longfellows made a trip in 1869 to Europe, or before that, returned in 1869. And in Paris, Edith and Anne had purchased a wallpaper they described as, quote, a beautiful shade of green with bright birds and leaves. And this was used in their bedroom, which was the room over the study. So about in the late 1860s, many of the rooms were redecorated. A little earlier in the 1860s, Brother Charlie had repapered his bedroom in the L with an American-made wallpaper with very strong geometric design. And you can see that photograph of that in situ on the left-hand side, and a small fragment of the actual paper underneath it. But in 1874, he chose even a stronger pattern when he turned the room into a much more exotic sitting room to house the things he had brought back from Japan. He put up a very colorful and bold neo-Grec pattern and decorated the ceiling with the fans that he had brought back. And I think that P.K. McClintock had talked to you in another Jim Shea lecture. In the 1880s, the dining room was brought up to date with a richly colored wallpaper printed in gold and maroon. And this is the one that remains on the walls today. These dark colors are what we think of as typically Victorian, although they didn't really appear in terms of decoration until the 1870s and 80s. And in the middle, I've put a sample of a William Morris paper called Sunflowers, which he designed in 1879, printed in the same color palette. And further on the right, you see what was called a Japanese leather paper, which were really elegant papers that were manufactured in Japan, not out of leather, but out of paper to imitate tooled leather. And they had a raised design that was picked out in gold. So you can see what was chosen for the dining room, probably by Alice, we think, after her father died, was very popular type of pattern, color palette at that period. And you can see how well it went with some of the oriental material that Charles Longfellow had brought back. And you also can see, and you're probably very familiar with the portrait, the three Longfellow daughters and their mother, Fanny Appleton, her sister, and my favorite little painting, the Hiawatha going into the sunset by Beamstar. There was one reference in the furnishing report that Anne Longfellow Thorpe, probably in the early 1930s, before she died, was thinking the dining room paper was looking very shabby. And she knew someone who knew everything about colonial taste and thought that maybe he could advise them on picking a new paper. And I think I'm awfully glad they didn't follow through. After 1885, Alice Longfellow was the primary occupant of the house at 105 Brattle Street. Ernest, Anne, and Edith were married, and Charlie lived in Boston until his death in 1893. And although she didn't do many changes in the major first floor rooms, I think the family decided early on that these were the rooms that were really important to keep as their father, the poet, had arranged them. But the rest of the house was pretty much fair game. She lived in it, and she wanted it to be up to date. So in 1895, she hired a cousin, Alexander Wadsworth Longfellow, who was an architect, to make some of the changes, to update the bathrooms. He installed an elevator, and he designed the corner cupboard in the passageway between the parlor and the dining room that you can see in the left-hand image in the colonial revival style. You can see it with this lunette window and its scrolled pediment, typical motifs of the colonial revival period. By the 1890s, many new houses were incorporating details from 18th century houses in their design. And their furnishings were an eclectic combination of old and new, as you can see in the images on the screen. One is somewhere I have it, the Hayden Bryant House in Manchester, Mass. The stair hall in the left-hand image, and the stair hall in the lower right is one designed by another colonial revival architect, Arthur Little, for his house in the Back Bay. And you can see that the wallpapers chosen for these colonial revival interiors aren't reproductions, and they're by no means subtle. This one was called the Thelma. I don't know why, but things did have pattern names. And it's one of these wonderful combinations of almost Art Nouveau and arts and crafts. And we know Alice Longfellow was very interested in the arts and crafts movement and member of the Boston Arts and Crafts Society. But she chose some more subtle wallpapers for her real colonial house, not her colonial revival house. And they were more subtle designs in, again, a more monochromatic palette that her parents seemed to like. The boldest wallpaper she chose was for her bathroom, and was called Persian tiles. I don't know what it is about people's powder rooms and bathrooms. They seem to be able to choose much more bold wallpapers than they do for any other room in their house, and it continues on today. More traditional floral patterns were used in bedrooms, perhaps just continuing the practice that had been there. These are more personal spaces, so they don't really need to make dramatic design statements like many wallpapers on the first floor. The ones you see in the illustration, in the black and white illustration, and the two samples you see on the lower screen were removed in the 1940s and 50s, when the family still, some family members still lived in the house, but other rooms were rented out. And the walls in all the bedrooms were painted, stripped of their wallpaper and painted, which was a standard practice at that time. The papers now, as you know, have been reproduced by the Park Service. I think the Park Service has done a wonderful job, and they deserve a huge amount of credit for the conservation of the wallpapers, their attention to their reproductions, but also for the careful stewardship of the house that was so treasured by the Longfellow family. And as you know, the house is indeed a national treasure today. Thank you. I heard there were lots of questions in the house. If I haven't answered them, hopefully I did some of them, but I'm happy to answer them now. Well, I guess I answered them. Yes.
When was that view done that's up there?
Probably in the 1870s or 80s. I think it's a great view.
Before the balustrade, I guess, was added.
Oh, before the balustrade was here, or the artist left it out. But
Yeah.
you can see that could be Longfellow and Edith. It's very similar to the photograph of the two of them in front of the house. But I love the artist's easel down here, painting the picture. I don't know whether it's a Louis Prang or not.
And what about the first one that you showed on your very first slide, your title
That's
slide?
the watercolor I am.
Nice. Nice.
Yeah, probably, what, 1840, 50. It's just a sweet little thing. Yes?
Do you know why Victorians like things by our perspective would be incredibly busy of different patterns that don't seem to go with each other, and mixing and matching, even if they're all in the yellow thing, but doing chintz with other patterns and scrolls?
I think it was just a progression. It's a very good question. It's one, and I don't think they thought it was probably that incongruous. They probably liked it. There were new dyes and fabrics that were really brilliant, and new pigments for the wallpaper. I think the 1860s, to me, are a very interesting period in terms of it's a much lighter Victorian palette, or much brighter Victorian palette than the heavy one we associate with the later years of the Victorian period. And you know, Queen Victoria herself loved those bright colors early on. And it's, you know, it just got heavier and more busy, and that's why people in the arts and crafts movement just said enough is enough. And the French wallpaper designers had a lot to do with this. I mean, they were so involved in making realistic depictions of flowers and fauna, and even oil paintings. And people like Morris, as you know, just got sick of that, and really streamlined design, basically. Yes.
Is the walls, clamshell and horsehair?
I imagine they're horsehair plaster, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And my other question is, because you brought it up, the pigments became chemical pigments as we get into this period. They're not natural pigment, they're
The-
chemical.
The earliest ones were natural, and again, there were a lot of chemical dyes and pigments later on, as the 19th century progressed. There's been much written lately about, you know, the amount of arsenic in wallpaper. And many people, I know Sarah Codman, who lived in historic New England's Codman House in the 1860s, had all the wallpapers tested by a doctor for their arsenic content, which was really, I think, fairly early. And the ones that had the most arsenic were not green. They were the ones that were very light in color. So it was just something that was part of producing wallpaper. Yes.
Are some of these papers still being marketed anywhere?
The reproduction market in wallpaper goes up and down. It depends, again, it depends on what is fashionable for today's interiors. And I think unfortunately, today's sort of crate and barrel aesthetic doesn't like wallpaper. In the 1970s, when I wrote the book Wallpapers for Historic Buildings that David mentioned, there was a great interest in historic houses, and people really wanted reproductions of all periods, even the Victorian papers. Companies like Bradbury and Bradbury in California still silkscreen reproductions of late Victorian papers, and there's a company in New York State called Delphi Paper Hangings that block prints wallpaper. Not cheap, but they're beautiful. Yes.
I have a question on the Gothic wallpaper on the back hall
Yes.
of Longfellows. We were looking at it, and it seems to be 3 or 4 colorways, pretty detailed. You showed an image of it earlier, and I was just wondering, that back hall is very narrow, very dark. It's really sort of, as an occupant, it's really difficult to appreciate the wallpaper. Any thoughts on why that would have been part of the back hall?
Yeah, it is curious because it goes behind the the handrail and the balusters, so the paper hanger must have had a wonderful time. But it also continued up into the second floor stair hall, so I think you would get a better view of it and be able to appreciate the design even more upstairs than in that narrow passage staircase that you saw tonight. Any other? Oh, yes.
Earlier today, we were hearing about the wallpaper in the dining room, what's presently the dining room,
Right.
and the thinking up until you started to speak, was that these were cheap stenciled papers placed there by the Vassalls
Right,
when it was a kitchen.
right.
I wanted to clarify, you are now saying that these are expensive handmade wallpapers
They're
imported
expensive hand-painted Chinese wallpaper.
from, by the Craigies.
By the Craigies,
Is there a tradition of wallpapering at all in kitchens or other back rooms
Yes.
in the period, the Vassal period?
Well, in the Vassal period, I'm not sure. In the late 18th century, you do get references, newspaper references to paper in kitchens, and there are several examples. We know in the first Harrison Ray Otis house, which is 1796, that the Otises had a dark blue paper in the kitchen with a rather pleasant design and a border. So it was, a pretty nice kitchen to work with. In the 18th century, early 18th century, lots of kitchens had painted spots on them. But I don't know, I haven't found much real physical evidence of kitchens. Kitchens get changed so radically all the time that finding wallpaper fragments isn't as common as in the rest of, in other rooms in a house.
Richard, could I add one quick item about that Chinese in the Shirley Eustace house breakfast room? It was actually put in by the McGees in the China trade between 1798 and 1806 or so. And what I neglected to tell you is there is in my file somewhere, when I can find it, a very narrow border that went along the top that was very similar to the stripe of, floral stripe. But it has been reproduced, the paper itself, by Brunswick and Feast, and
It
may
was.
be
It
still
was.
available, I doubt it.
I doubt it. I don't think so, but it
But
was
it
reproduced in 1985.
Yeah.
Jim?
I'm just from Nathaniel Tracy. He, of course, is one of the owners is little known about, and he's not talking a lot about the house. But he did own the house for a while and has trophy homes all on the North Shore, including in Marblehead. Do you know anything about his other homes, and how he, Wallpaper, are they still extant? I know Historic New England owns one of his homes in Newburyport, I think.
Right, the Spencer Pierce Little House
Yeah.
was the farm in Newbury. It's a 17th century manor house that I think he retreated to, and he actually died there. He was incredibly wealthy. He married Jeremiah Lee's daughter, which was a nice marriage for him. And as you say, he did own these trophy houses. One of them is still in Newbury, and there is one wallpaper sample from that house, and it's a little later, and it's one of those very elaborate French Réveillon type wallpapers, similar to the one I showed you. But it'd be fascinating to know what
We had
traces.
seven parties at his house in Cambridge. He was famous, his parties were famous in
Right.
the house.
Yeah.
So I assume he decorated the house in a way that you don't know much
think,
about.
but I also think that even though we sort of think people redecorated every time they turned around, they often didn't. And I think, if Vassall had a flocked wallpaper in the parlor, that still could have been stylish in the 1780s. I mean, considered very stylish. None of these people who had all this money, like Tracy and Craigie, ripped out any of the woodwork and installed pedal mantles and got rid of all the paneling and everything, like so many other people did when they updated the house. So, and I don't know whether that's because it was Washington's headquarters, and I know the Longfellows were very, very concerned about making too many changes, as you know, because of the Washington, the Washington connection. Well, thank you very much.